To the tabloids, Barbara Hutton was the poor little rich girl. To the banks, she was a walking GDP. But to her 7 husbands, she was simply an undefended natural resource, a diamond mine with the gates left open. This is the brutal accounting of the Woolworth heiress who inherited a billion-dollar fortune at 21, only to die alone with just a few $1,000s to her name. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was a systematic human looting. From fake Russian princes to cruel counts and Dominican playboys, these men viewed Barbara not as a wife, but as a transaction. They exploited her, psychologically manipulated her, and divorced her for millions, turning the richest orphan in America into a fortune stripped bare by the aristocracy. Even Cary Grant, the only man who didn't want her money, couldn't save her from the sharks. Mindavani was a high-end grifter from Georgia, a prince in title only. He didn't woo Barbara, he annexed her. He demanded a $1 million cash dowry just to show up at the altar. Once married, he treated the Woolworth fortune as his personal ATM, buying polo ponies and jewelry while mocking Barbara's body to keep her insecure. His cruelty coincided with the eating disorder that would haunt her for the rest of her life. After 2 years of financial and emotional strip mining, Mandavani took a massive divorce settlement and left. Though he died in a Rolls-Royce crash shortly after, he had proven a dangerous concept to the world. Barbara Hutton was vulnerable. He had put blood in the water, and the next shark, Count Reventlow, was already circling. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so do predators. When Prince Mandavani died in that car crash in Spain, he left a vacancy in the life of the world's richest woman. Barbara Hutton was 23 years old. She was emotionally shattered, financially besieged, and dangerously conditioned to believe that abuse was a form of affection. She was a wounded animal separated from the herd. In the wild, a wounded animal attracts scavengers, but in the high society of 1930s Europe, it attracted someone far more dangerous, a man obsessed with control. Trauma often takes time to heal. Barbara Hutton took 24 hours to replace her tormentor. The divorce from Mandavani became final on a Monday. On Tuesday, she married Count Court Haugwitz Reventlow. It was a decision made in a state of panic, a desperate attempt to plug the hole in her soul with a new title, a new protector, a new owner. She thought she was marrying a nobleman who would shield her from the world that hated her. She was wrong. She had traded a grifter for a sadist. If Mandavani was a thief who picked her pocket, Reventlow was a jailer who isolated her completely. The Mandavani era had cost her millions of dollars. The Reventlow era would cost her something far more valuable, her sanity. Count Court Haugwitz Reventlow was a Danish nobleman with a lineage as old as it was cold. He was the antithesis of the charming, oily Mandavani. Reventlow did not smile. He did not cajole. He commanded. He was a man of his time, the late 1930s in Europe, a time when the continent was tilting toward fascism. Reventlow possessed a Prussian temperament, rigid, domineering, and obsessed with control. He viewed Barbara not as a wife, but as a territory he had conquered. And like any occupying force, his first order of business was to secure the borders. He moved Barbara to London, into a massive fortress-like mansion in Regent's Park. It was called Winfield House. It was built with Woolworth money, Barbara's money, but Reventlow ran it like a military barracks. The isolation began immediately. Reventlow fired Barbara's loyal staff, the maids who knew her secrets, the secretaries who managed her correspondence. He replaced them with his own people. He wanted eyes and ears in every room. He intercepted her mail. He monitored her phone calls. He decided who she could see and when. He convinced Barbara that this surveillance was for her own good. He told her that the world was full of kidnappers, revolutionaries and thieves who wanted her money. He told her that she was weak, stupid, and defenseless, and that he was the only thing standing between her and destruction. It followed a pattern now recognized as psychological manipulation and gaslighting. He created a reality where he was the god of her universe. Barbara, terrified of the public who spat at her car and the press who mocked her, believed him. She retreated behind the high walls of Winfield House, grateful to her captor for locking the door. But the prison walls weren't just made of brick. They were made of chemistry. This is the chapter of Barbara's life where the physical liquidation begins. Madhavani had started the anorexia by calling her fat. Reventlow weaponized it. He was obsessed with her appearance. He wanted a wife who looked like a marble statue, pale, thin, and silent. When Barbara complained of hunger or pain or anxiety, Reventlow didn't offer comfort. He offered a pill. Under Reventlow, Barbara's dependence on prescription drugs became deeply entrenched. He introduced her to a terrifying cocktail that would destroy her metabolism and rot her internal organs over the next 40 years. The cycle was brutal. In the morning, she took amphetamines. These suppressed her appetite, keeping her weight dangerously low to please the Count, and gave her a frantic artificial energy to get through the social obligations he demanded. At night, when the speed made her heart race and her mind spin, she took barbiturates to crash. When the emotional pain of his verbal abuse became too much, or when her starving body ached, there was morphine. Barbara Hutton was not a recreational drug user. She was a medical experiment conducted by her husband. She was kept in a state of chemical twilight, pliable, confused, and dependent. The drugs numbed the reality of the violence, and there was violence. The rumors in London society were dark. Servants whispered about screams coming from the master bedroom. Barbara would appear at dinners wearing long sleeves in summer, heavy makeup covering bruises on her arms and face. Reventlow was a brute. When she displeased him by saying the wrong thing, by looking at him the wrong way, he beat her, and then he would tell her it was her fault. If she hadn't been so stupid, he wouldn't have had to correct her. In 1936, into this house of horrors, a child was born. Barbara gave birth to a son, Lance Reventlow. He would be the only child she ever had. The birth itself was a nightmare. Accounts suggest Barbara suffered a difficult labor, likely exacerbated by her frailty and drug use. For Barbara, Lance was a miracle. He was the first human being she could love who wouldn't leave her. He was an object of pure, unadulterated affection in a world of transactions. But for Count Reventlow, the baby was a complication. First, the child was a male heir. That was good for the dynasty. But the child took Barbara's attention away from Reventlow. That was unacceptable. The Count was a narcissist of the highest order. He could not tolerate competition, even from his own infant son. He began to interfere in the parenting. He criticized Barbara's mothering skills. He controlled access to the nursery. He weaponized the baby. If Barbara didn't obey him, he would threaten to take Lance away. He told her she was an unfit mother, a junkie, and a madwoman, and that no court would let her keep the boy. This was the ultimate leverage. Barbara would endure the beatings. She would endure the starvation. She would endure the isolation. But she would not endure losing Lance. The trap was shut tight. She was a hostage, and her son was the collateral. By 1938, the situation inside Winfield House had become life-threatening. The abuse had escalated from correctional to homicidal. Reventlow's temper was becoming erratic. The drugs were making Barbara paranoid. The breaking point came with a threat that Barbara could not ignore. During a violent argument fueled by Reventlow's rage and perhaps his own fears about the looming war in Europe, he allegedly threatened to kidnap Lance. He allegedly threatened to take the boy to Germany deep into the heart of the Nazi regime. He told Barbara she would never see her son again. Some accounts go further. They suggest Reventlow threatened to have Barbara committed to an asylum or even killed to seize full control of the Woolworth fortune. The survival instinct, dormant for years under layers of morphine and trauma, finally kicked in. Barbara realized she was not just fighting for her dignity, she was fighting for her life and her son's future. She needed to escape. But you don't just walk out on a man like Reventlow. You have to flee. She planned her exit with the few loyal friends she had left. She waited for a moment of distraction. She grabbed Lance and she ran. She fled London for Paris and then eventually back to the United States. She had escaped the physical prison of Winfield House, but she had not escaped the Count. He followed her not with a gun but with a team of lawyers. The divorce battle of 1938 was a bloodbath. It was front-page news across the globe. Reventlow played his hand perfectly. He knew Barbara's weakness was Lance. He launched a custody war that was designed to inflict maximum terror. He used the Danish laws. He used the British courts. He used every legal avenue to demand custody of the boy. He painted Barbara as a drug addict, an adulteress, and a mentally unstable wreck. He dragged her name through the mud, exposing her private hell to the public, who already hated her. Barbara was terrified. She truly believed Reventlow would take Lance. She was willing to pay anything to make him stop. And that, of course, was the plan all along. The lawyers hammered out a deal. It is known in history as Danegeld, the money you pay a Viking raider to leave your village alone. Barbara paid Reventlow a settlement that was, at the time, staggering. She essentially bought her freedom and her son back from her husband. She paid him to go away. Reventlow took the money. He retreated to Europe, a wealthy man leaving behind a woman who was physically broken and psychologically shattered. He left her with a kidney ailment that would plague her for life. He left her with a crushing addiction to opiates. And he left her with a profound paranoid fear that everyone who got close to her wanted to hurt her. Barbara Hutton was free. She was back in America. She had her son. But the woman who stepped off the boat in New York was not the same woman who had left. She was hauntingly thin, her hands shook, and her eyes were empty. The Reventlow regime had fallen, but it had scorched the earth. Barbara was now 30 years old, but her body felt 60. She was terrified of men, terrified of the dark, and terrified of herself. She needed a savior. She needed someone who wasn't a prince, wasn't a count, wasn't a predator. She needed someone who didn't need her money. And in the strangest twist of Hollywood fate, that is exactly who walked through the door next. In the corporate history of Barbara Hutton, the years 1938 to 1942 represent a false dawn. She had escaped the physical prison of Count Reventlow's Europe. She had paid the ransom. She had fled to California, the land of reinvention. She was 26 years old, the richest woman in the world and free. But freedom is a terrifying concept for a prisoner who has forgotten how to walk. Barbara arrived in Hollywood not as a conquering queen, but as a wreck. She weighed barely 90 pounds. Her hands shook from withdrawal. She was paranoid, convinced that every man who smiled at her was calculating her net worth, and that every shadow contained a kidnapper. The infrastructure of her soul had been bombed out by Mandavani and Reventlow. She didn't need a husband. She needed a hospital. She needed intense psychiatric care and drug rehabilitation. Instead, she got a movie star. And not just any movie star. She met the only man in her life who would try to save her, not steal from her. This is the chapter of the Cary Grant interlude. It is the most heartbreaking chapter of all, because it proves the cruelest rule of trauma. You can offer a drowning person a lifeline, But if they have been drowning long enough, they will mistake the rope for a noose. Archie Leach was born in poverty in Bristol, England. He had clawed his way up from the vaudeville circuit, reinvented himself as Cary Grant, and conquered Hollywood. By the time he met Barbara Hutton, he was one of the highest paid actors on the planet. This is the critical data point. Cary Grant was rich. He had his own fortune. He had his own fame. He had his own ego. For the first time in her life, Barbara Hutton was sitting across the table from a man who didn't need her checkbook. They met in the swirling social circles of wartime Hollywood. Grant was drawn to her, not to the money, but to the vulnerability. He saw past the diamonds and the Woolworth label. He saw a frightened, damaged girl who reminded him of his own chaotic, impoverished childhood. He had a savior complex. He believed he could fix her. For Barbara, Grant was an alien species. He was funny. He was gentle. He didn't order her around. He asked her opinion. He didn't hit her. He held her hand. They married in 1942 at Lake Arrowhead. It was quiet, understated. No thousands of orchids, no 4 orchestras, just 2 people trying to find shelter from the storm. On paper, it looked like the perfect merger, the queen of capital and the king of cinema, but the market, the public, refused to buy the stock. The tragedy of this marriage began outside the bedroom, in the editorial offices of the gossip columns. The world hated Barbara Hutton. They resented her wealth during the Depression, and they resented it even more during World War II. And the world loved Cary Grant. They couldn't reconcile the two. They refused to believe that their beloved screen idol could genuinely love the toxic heiress. So, they invented a narrative. The press coined the nickname Cash and Carry. It was a slur. It implied that Grant was a gigolo, a high-class prostitute who had sold his charm for Woolworth stock. It was a lie. Grant had explicitly signed a prenuptial agreement waiving his right to her money. But the truth didn't sell newspapers. The nickname devastated Grant. He was a proud, self-made man. He had worked for every dime he had. To be painted as a gold digger humiliated him. But the nickname did something worse to Barbara. It fed her paranoia. The voices of her past husbands, M. Devani and Reventlow, were still screaming in her head. No one loves you. They only want the money. You are ugly. You are boring. You are a bank account. When the press screamed cash and carry, Barbara began to wonder if they were right. Why would he love me? She thought. I'm a junkie. I'm a skeleton. I'm broken. He must want something. She began to test him. It is a classic trauma response. Push the person away to see if they come back. If they leave, you were right. If they stay, you push harder. Inside the marriage, Cary Grant was fighting a war on 2 fronts. Front 1 was Barbara's health. He was horrified by her drug intake. He saw the doctors, the Dr. Feelgoods of the era, who kept prescribing her amphetamines and opiates. Grant tried to intervene. There are stories of him flushing her pills down the toilet. He tried to get her to eat. He bought her steaks, chocolates, anything to put meat on her bones. He tried to limit her alcohol. He tried to institute a routine: wake up, exercise, eat, sleep. He was trying to deprogram her from the Reventlow regime. Front 2 was her son, Lance. Lance Reventlow was now a young boy traumatized by the custody battle and his mother's erratic behavior. Grant stepped in as a father. He was the first healthy male role model Lance had ever known. He spent time with the boy, played with him, protected him from the press. For a brief moment, Lance had a dad and Barbara had a partner. But you cannot cure a lifetime of addiction with love alone. Barbara fought him. When he took away the pills, she hid stashes in the lining of her curtains, in her shoes, in the chandeliers. When he tried to make her eat, she drank instead. She began to resent his control, even though Grant's control was benevolent. aimed at saving her life. To Barbara, it felt like Reventlow all over again. He's telling me what to do. He's watching me. He's controlling me. The wires in her brain were crossed. She couldn't distinguish between a jailer and a doctor. She lashed out. Barbara began to surround herself with a court of sycophants, parasites who fed off her insecurity. They whispered to her that Grant was boring, that he was too strict, that he didn't understand her artistic soul. She began to humiliate him in public. She would arrive late to his premieres. She would get intoxicated and make scenes. She would accuse him of sleeping with his co-stars. She created chaos because chaos was the only environment she felt at home in. Peace felt suspicious to her. And Grant, for all his patience, was human. He was a movie star used to being adored, not accused. The humiliation of the cash and carry label, combined with Barbara's refusal to get well, began to wear him down. He realized a terrible truth. He couldn't save her. She was sinking. And if he held on too tight, she would pull him under with her. The end didn't come with a scream, but with a whimper. The marriage eroded. Grant realized that he was married to a ghost, a woman who was physically present but chemically absent. In 1945, they filed for divorce. The world waited for the other shoe to drop. The press sharpened their pencils, ready to write the headline about how much money the gigolo Grant had extracted from the heiress. They expected a Reventlow-style shakedown. They expected millions. And then the news broke. Cary Grant asked for nothing. Zero, no alimony, no settlement, no property. In fact, the only thing exchanged was a check for a nominal amount to cover legal fees, which Grant reportedly never cashed. He walked away. This should have been a victory for Barbara. She had kept her fortune intact, but in reality, it was the most devastating moment of her life. When Mindavani took her money, it proved he was a thief. When Reventlow took her money, it proved he was a brute. When Cary Grant took nothing, it proved that he had actually loved her, and she had driven him away. She couldn't blame his greed. She couldn't blame his ambition. She was left with the naked, horrifying realization that she was the problem. She had held genuine love in her hands, and she had crushed it because she didn't recognize the texture of it. Grant remained the only ex-husband who spoke well of her. Years later, he would say, Barbara surrounded herself with a consortium of fakes. She was the most misunderstood woman I ever knew. He moved on to other marriages, other movies, a long life. He survived the orbit of the Woolworth planet. Barbara did not. With Grant gone, the last line of defense was removed. The rehabilitation project had failed. The building was condemned. Barbara Hutton was 33 years old. She was an addict. She was alone. And she still had hundreds of millions of dollars. The cash and carry era was over. The era of the liquidation sale was about to begin. The next husbands wouldn't be movie stars with their own money. They would be the bottom of the barrel. They would be the vultures who waited until the animal was too weak to fight back. Barbara turned back to her medicine cabinet, opened the amber bottle, and swallowed the darkness. She was ready for the next cage. When Cary Grant walked out the door in 1945, he took the last scrap of dignity in Barbara Hutton's life with him. The false dawn was over. The rehabilitation project was abandoned. Now the liquidation sale began in earnest. From 1947 to 1960, Barbara Hutton's life dissolved into a blur of desperate transactions. She stopped looking for love. She started buying distractions. She was a woman standing in a burning room, throwing money at the flames, hoping they would stop consuming her. The husbands that followed were not partners. They were not even jailers like Reventlow. They were tourists. They visited the sovereign state of Barbara Hutton, took photos, took souvenirs, looted the treasury, and moved on. The quality of the mergers dropped precipitously. We move now from the A-list to the bargain bin of the aristocracy. We move from the tragic to the grotesque. Husband number 4 was another prince, because Barbara was a creature of habit, and the brand princess was the only identity she felt comfortable wearing. Prince Igor Trubetskoy was a Russian emigre with a shaky title and a need for speed. He was a professional race car driver. He was younger than Barbara, penniless and bored. They married in 1947 in Zurich. It was a whim. Barbara was looking for excitement to numb the pain of losing Grant. Igor was looking for a sponsor for his racing team. It was a sponsorship deal masquerading as a marriage. Igor used the Woolworth fortune to fuel his addiction to adrenaline. He bought cars. He drove in the Monaco Grand Prix. He left Barbara sitting in the pits, holding a stopwatch, while he risked his life and her inheritance on the tarmac. But the speed couldn't outrun the darkness. Barbara's drug use was escalating. The amphetamines made her manic. The barbiturates made her catatonic. Igor, a man of action, had no patience for a wife who spent weeks in bed staring at the ceiling. The breaking point came in 1948. The news broke that Barbara Hutton had been rushed to a hospital in Paris. She had been hospitalized after a serious suicide attempt. The world gasped, but then they shrugged. It was just another chapter in the soap opera. Igor Trubetskoy didn't rush to her bedside to comfort her. He rushed to his lawyers. He used her suicide attempt, a cry for help from a drowning woman, as leverage. He claimed she was mentally unstable. He filed for divorce. He drove away with a settlement, leaving Barbara with scars on her wrists and another failed merger on her balance sheet. She was alone again, but the worst predator was yet to come. If Alexis Medavani was the prototype, Porfirio Rubirosa was the finished product. Rubirosa was a diplomat from the Dominican Republic, but his real profession was playboy. He is often cited as one of the inspirations for the James Bond lifestyle. He had already been married to Doris Duke, the tobacco heiress. He had stripped her assets and moved on. Now, he set his sights on the Woolworth fortune. But here is the twist. Rubirosa didn't even pretend to like Barbara. He was openly, publicly, and passionately in love with the actress Zsa Zsa Gabor. He was living with Zsa Zsa. He was sleeping with Zsa Zsa. So why did he marry Barbara Hutton in 1953? Because Zsa Zsa wouldn't marry him until he had more money. And Barbara Hutton was the easiest bank robber he could plan. The wedding was a farce. Barbara, deep in an opiate haze, could barely stand. She broke her ankle before the ceremony and had to be carried. Rubirosa said, "I do," in a rush. The marriage lasted exactly 53 days. It was a smash-and-grab job. Rubirosa didn't even unpack his suitcases. He spent the 53 days spending money at a rate that baffled accountants. He bought polo ponies. He bought sports cars. And, in the ultimate act of humiliation, he spent lavishly on aircraft and extravagant symbols of power. He continued to see Zsa Zsa Gabor the entire time. The press called it the ménage à trois of the century. Barbara was the bank. Zsa Zsa was the mistress. Rubirosa was the thief. When the 53 days were up, he filed for divorce. The settlement was astronomical. Rubirosa walked away with a coffee plantation in the Dominican Republic, the B-25 bomber, the ponies, and $2.5 million in cash. He took the money and went back to Zsa Zsa Gabor. Barbara didn't fight it. She didn't have the energy. She signed the check. She was paying him to leave just as she had paid the others. But this time, the humiliation was total. The world saw her not just as a victim, but as a fool. She was the woman who paid a man millions to cheat on her for 7 weeks. After the violence of Reventlow and the looting of Rubirosa, husband number 6 was a retreat into silence. Baron Gottfried von Kram was a German tennis star, a Wimbledon finalist. He was a man of integrity. He had been imprisoned by the Nazis for refusing to be a propaganda tool and for his homosexuality. He was openly homosexual, a fact Barbara was aware of. Barbara knew this. By 1955, she wasn't looking for a lover. She was looking for a nurse. She was looking for a companion who wouldn't hit her and wouldn't rob her blind. She thought von Kram, a gentleman with his own tragic past, would be a safe harbor. They married in Versailles. It was a quiet affair. It was the union of two broken people trying to hold each other up. But a marriage based on mutual brokenness cannot survive. Von Kram had his own life, his own secrets, and his own business in Germany. He couldn't spend his days sitting in hotel rooms watching Barbara sleep off a morphine high. Barbara's addiction was now the third person in the marriage. She was disappearing. She spent days in a twilight state drinking vodka out of teacups and taking pills by the handful. She was becoming incoherent. Von Kram tried in his way to help, but he was a ghost and she was a shadow. They drifted apart. They divorced in 1959. He died in a car crash in Cairo shortly after. Another husband dead in a car. The curse of the Hutton husbands became a tabloid staple, but the real curse was staying alive. By the late 1950s, the husbands were only part of the problem. Barbara had retreated to Tangier, turning her back on the America that mocked her. She built a court. But it wasn't a court of nobility, it was a court of parasites. Because she had been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love her, Barbara tried to buy friendship. She became a generosity addict. If a guest admired a jade vase, she gave it to them. If a hairdresser told her a sad story, she bought them a house. She wrote checks to poets who didn't write, painters who didn't paint, and counts who had no counties. She was surrounded by a phalanx of sycophants who called her princess to her face and laughed at her behind her back. They kept the drugs flowing because a high Barbara was a generous Barbara. They encouraged her delusions. They isolated her from anyone, like her son Lance, who might try to intervene. The Woolworth fortune, once thought to be inexhaustible, began to show the bottom. She was spending millions a year to maintain a lifestyle that was killing her. She was buying affection at retail price, and the markup was killing her portfolio. And where was Lance, the boy she had saved from Reventlow, the boy Cary Grant had fathered? He was distant. He loved his mother, but he couldn't watch her die. He couldn't watch the parade of gigolos. He couldn't watch the drugs. He had built his own life in America, racing cars, trying to outrun the shadow of the Woolworth curse. He visited her, but the visits were painful. She would be high, incoherent, confusing him with his father or with Cary Grant. Barbara had realized her worst fear. She hadn't lost her son to a kidnapper. She hadn't lost him to Reventlow. She had lost him to her own addiction. By 1960, she was 48 years old. She looked 70. She had one husband left to go and very little money left to steal. The predator class had moved on to fresher meat. The scavengers were picking at the bones. The party was over. The lights were being turned off, but Barbara Hutton had to stay for the bitter end. She retreated to a hotel room, drew the curtains, and prepared for the final act of the tragedy, the bankruptcy of the soul. The seventh and final husband was a footnote in a biography already written in red ink. In 1964, Barbara bought a title for the last time. His name was Pierre Raymond Doane, a chemist artist, and an adopted member of the former royal family of Champassac. He was known as the Prince of the Cham. The marriage lasted 2 years. It cost her another settlement, another slice of the dwindling principal, but by then, the numbers had lost their meaning. The transaction was mechanical. Barbara was no longer marrying men. She was leasing temporary alleviation from the silence. But the silence was about to become deafening. The universe, having watched Barbara Hutton survive 6 predatory husbands and decades of self-inflicted chemical warfare, decided to deliver the coup de grace. It didn't strike her bank account. It struck the only asset she held that had retained any true value. On a snowy afternoon in 1972, a small plane crashed into the side of a mountain near Aspen, Colorado. Inside was Lance Reventlow, her son, the baby she had shielded from the Nazis. The boy Cary Grant had tried to father, the man who had tried to build a life outside the blast radius of the Woolworth fortune. He was dead at 36. When the news reached Barbara, the poor little rich girl finally ceased to exist. In her place was a breathing corpse. Lance was the tether that had kept her loosely connected to the earth. Without him, she simply floated away into the ether of madness. She didn't attend his funeral. She couldn't. The grief was not an emotion. It was a total systemic failure. The final years of Barbara Hutton were played out in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. It was a mausoleum of her own making. The curtains were drawn tight against the California sun. The air was stale, smelling of old flowers and rubbing alcohol. The liquidation was now entering its terminal phase. The physical depreciation was horrific. The woman who had once been the envy of the world, a beauty who inspired poets, had withered away. She weighed less than 80 pounds. Her bones were brittle, her teeth were gone, and her eyesight was failing. She relied on hired staff to help move her from her bed to the bathroom. But the spending didn't stop. It mutated. In those final twilight years, Barbara didn't buy jewelry to wear. She bought jewelry to give away. She would invite total strangers, hotel maids, bellboys, random acquaintances into her suite. She would pay them thousands of dollars just to sit with her, to listen to her, to prove she was still there. She would hand a guest a diamond ring worth a house and say, "Take it. It's heavy. It hurts my hand." It was the ultimate fire sale. She was divesting herself of the cursed Woolworth loot, throwing the cargo overboard in a desperate attempt to keep the sinking ship afloat for one more hour. By 1979, the walking GDP had finally collapsed. On May 11th, Barbara Hutton died of a heart attack. She was 66 years old, but her body was a century old. She died in the hotel, surrounded by the remnants of a glory that had never brought her a single day of peace. And then came the final accounting. The forensic team opened the books to see what remained of the empire. In 1933, she had inherited a fortune equivalent to $1 billion today. She had owned palaces in Tangier, mansions in London, plantations in the Dominican Republic. She had owned the most magnificent collection of jewelry in private hands. When the executors tallied the ledger at the moment of her death, they found the balance: $3,500. It was all gone. The palaces were sold. The diamonds were pawned or stolen. The husbands, the hangers-on, the lawyers, and the drugs had consumed it all. The autopsy of Barbara Hutton reveals a terrifying truth about the American dream. We are taught that money is a shield, a fortress that protects us from the indignities of life. Barbara Hutton proved that money is not a fortress. It is blood in the water. She was buried next to her son, Lance, in the Woolworth family mausoleum in the Bronx. In the end, the richest orphan in America returned to the only place where her net worth didn't matter. The investigation is closed. The economy has crashed. The account is empty. Barbara Hutton had finally paid her last bill.